The motion for this debate is this House believes that nations which refuse to include women athletes on their teams should be barred from participating in the Olympic Games. Without further ado, I invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. Please welcome Hari Govind.
With great power comes great responsibility. And that's what side proposition stands by. Because in the international scene, in the Olympic Games, provides a strong message to all nations that we have to stand by women. This is what side proposition wants. Firstly, a couple of definitions for the House today. What exactly are the Olympic Games? They are the most watched sporting event in the whole world, with up to a viewership audience of 3 billion. It's the most coveted international sporting event, where countries around the world try their best to take part. But we have to understand that the Olympic Games is not only about winning, but about inclusiveness and striving to achieve humanistic ideals of fairness and equality. And this is what the Olympic Games has tried to promote in every one of its 4-year once convenings. A simple clarification for the House today. This debate is not about nations that don't have female athletes who fit the requirements, but it's about those who do have these female athletes but refuse to allow them to take part. And secondly, this is a purely value judgment debate, where side proposition doesn't need an actual policy, no thank you ma'am, but rather it's about the ideals of whether women must be allowed to take part. Our case division for the House today is simple. I, as the first speaker, will be talking about the principles of the Olympic Games, which have to be upheld. I'll also talk to you about how this boosts the women's rights activists on the national scale. No thank you ma'am. And I'll finally be talking to you about how this helps on the international scale. Well, my second speaker will be talking to you about how we have to preserve meritocracy and increase the credibility of the Olympic Games. So, before we move on to our substantives, here's a simple context of nations that refuse to allow these women athletes to take part. We have to understand that these nations, no thank you sir, are nations which often have poor women's rights records, where these women are systematically oppressed and abused in these nations, where they can't go to school, or they can't drive, or can't vote. And there's also a rape culture in these kinds of nations. We bring to you examples of how Iran and Afghanistan have a history of these forms of poor women's rights records and barring women from taking part in the Olympic Games. Moving on to our first substantive, on how this motion regresses the spirit of the Olympics. The thesis of my argument is that the Olympics is principally founded upon the basic ideals of inclusiveness and equality. And when nations refuse to send females, they destroy these fundamentals. Before we move on, let's look at the creed of the Olympic Games. The most important thing in the Olympic Games is not to win, but to promote inclusiveness. This is what the Olympic Games stands by, and its basic ideals of promoting gender and race equality. We saw this in the Black Salute a few years ago during the Civil Rights Movement, and we see this over and over again in the Olympic Games, where they seek to promote these ideals. Not only do they seek to promote this, but they also look to meritocracy, where athletes who are able to meet the requirements and are allowed by the nations to take part can come for these games. So, what happens when nations systematically oppress their female athletes and they refuse to allow them to take part? They destroy the basic humanistic ideals which the Olympic Games oppose. And what does this mean? This means that therefore, given that these nations do not care and they disrespect the values of the Olympics, they should be barred. I'll take it in a moment, sir. But here's where we have to realize that the Olympic Games is more than just winning, and we have to keep this in all our games. Yes, sir.
Would you bar nations from the United Nations if they had a record of gender rights abuses?
Sir, we would, because we understand that the United Nations is also about a very similar ideal of promoting gender equality and ensuring there are no human rights transgressions. Where women are not allowed to go to education, where they're not allowed to vote and they're not allowed to drive, these are basic human rights transgressions which our side still stands by. A nation which doesn't respect up to half its population is a nation which shouldn't have place in the UN. Moving on to my second substantive, on how when we disallow these nations from going to the Olympic Games, we boost the women's rights and feminists on a national scale. The thesis of my argument is that our side strengthens women's rights advocates, as it shows that the whole world is with them and in their support. And this is especially the case because when we disallow them from taking part in the Olympics, an international event, it is a sign of solidarity that the whole international community is with these females in these nations, is with these female rights advocates. And this is especially the case because the Olympic Games is a rallying point, and sports is a rallying point which unifies people around the world. We see this in the case of Mary Kom, a female boxer in India, who through her boxing achievements, no thank you ma'am, has been able to unite the whole nation for females and leading to increased female rights given by the government for these females. We also give you the example of Manny Pacquiao, who reaches a parallel because of sports, where all the Filipino people, despite being affected by Typhoon Haiyan, are rallying under him because they understand that sports is a rallying point. We understand that when sports in the Olympic Games especially is a rallying point for the whole nation, this is why we have to show that the Olympic Games cannot tolerate women being abused. What is the effect of this? It means that now women's rights activists, I'll take it in a moment ma'am, are empowered by the fact that the whole world is with them. And I'll show you how this leads to legislative change and the promotion of more gender equality in these nations. Yes ma'am.
Tell us how your side helps women when all you do is create resentment towards these women within the countries, causing them to crack down on these women.
Ma'am, we have to understand that right now the situation is already bad. And if you don't let anything happen, all you're going to allow is this to get even worse. And when we take an international stance on this and apply diplomatic pressure on these nations to change, there is a track record of success, and I will be showing it to you later. Back to the significance of this. This now means that women's rights in the nation are improved, as now activists are empowered to push for legislative change. We saw this in the case of Saudi Arabia, when they were allowed to have a female soccer team, which ensured that now there are more rights being given to these females, such as them being allowed to drive, for instance. Moving on to my final substantive on how we promote international scale change for these women. The thesis of my argument is that when the International Olympic Committee bans these nations from taking part, we send a message to the whole world, not just these nations, that women's rights are important. And we have to understand, when one of the most important international events of the world, which has one of the highest viewership records of up to 3 billion people viewing it around the world, and when this event aligns itself with the humanistic ideal of female rights, we are able to send a very, very clear signal to the whole world that female, being half our world's population, have to be respected. And nations around the world are thereby further incentivized to ramp up efforts not only in their own nation for female rights, but around on a global scale as well, to promote equality and fairness of the sexes. We give you the example of how the United States of America has used diplomatic efforts and negotiations to bring about change and a better improvement in female rights, not only in its own nation, but in Saudi Arabia as well, which shows how that the United States of America is able to align itself with the international message sent that we have to promote women's rights as a whole. This change is not something which happens in their own nation, but around the world as well. And when one of the most important international events of the year, of every 4 years, aligns itself with this, it can only bring about good. Our side believes in this very fundamental concept. Women should be allowed to stand firmly and say, Siltius, Altius, Fortius.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 3 seconds.
Hello? Did you say 3? Or 3?
8 minutes and 3 seconds.
3? 3? 3? 8, 0, 3. Okay.
I thank the first proposition speaker for his speech. And now, to open the case for the opposition, please welcome Loh Yi Ning.
We cannot impose on a nation's sovereignty, we cannot further impede women's rights in our blind pursuit for equality. Let's take a look at the kind of context that side proposition gave us today. They told us that they were imposing this in countries with a poor women's rights records, but going by their context, what they mean is that this problem is already deeply ingrained in society, which means that imposing this kind of superficial measure isn't going to do anything to change this problem of mindsets. They then characterize this Olympic Games as an important rallying point. Precisely, ladies and gentlemen, because this is the only event where all nations come together as one and actually participate. But rather, when you ban nations from participating in this event, all that happens is you further isolate them from the international community and make them even more adverse. Therefore, their own characterization goes against them. Three parts of contention for the House today. Firstly, what's best for equality. Secondly, what's best for empowering women. And thirdly, whether or not their side does send that kind of international message. On the first part, equality and inclusiveness. We think, by their logic, they fundamentally violate their own logic of equality, because barring nations for their own policies, their own values, and their own domestic affairs already violates the principle of equality and inclusiveness. It already sends out a clear message of intolerance and imposition to these nations. That's why their side didn't uphold their own principle of equality in the first place. We then gave them a point of information whether or not they would bar these nations from the United Nations if they didn't uphold gender rights. They told us that they certainly would. But ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the kind of approach to these countries. They have an extremely punitive approach, which means all they do by barring them from international sporting events, barring them from the UN, is they punish these states, they make them clamp up, they make them isolated from the community, they remove any avenues through which these countries can discuss with other countries and get exposed to other viewpoints. And therefore, their side closed off all avenues of discussion, didn't truly stand for equality. And now transitioning to my second point of contention on empowering activists. Their side took a superficial, tokenistic measure towards empowering activists. They drew a false causational link between having a women's soccer team representing a country and there being any change within society of the mindset towards women. Because all that happens now, under their paradigm, was that countries would send females without any training to these athletic events. And all would happen was that on national television, they would watch these women athletes fail. And that wouldn't empower women in any way. But rather what their side did was give these countries even more excuses to pin blame on women, to shape societal mindsets in a way that's even more prejudiced towards women. That's why their side didn't empower women at all. They didn't promote ground-up change, but rather they had this kind of tokenistic approach that was half-hearted, didn't do anything to stand for women. On the third point of contention, where they told us that somehow an international message is going to be sent to all countries when this happens. This isn't true, ladies and gentlemen, because let's look at what really happens when you bar nations. You send a message to all countries that if you don't adhere by my values, if you don't adhere by what I deem to be a proper treatment of women, if you don't adhere to what I think is right, therefore I'm going to bar you from all events. I'm going to remove your rights to participate in the most important event of your nation. And that's why all this sends across is a message of intolerance. And all this does for countries all over the world, it makes them even more adverse to this kind of discussion. And it shuts them away from the community. And that's why they do send an international message, ladies and gentlemen. But this international message is one of intolerance and anger. We see today the Olympic Games, being the biggest international sporting events, functions on the principle of participation. The International Olympic Committee has 206 members, which is more than the UN, which is 193 members. Based on the principle of participation, there has been no precedent from barring nations from the Olympic Games, even in the event of political instability and conflict. For example, rogue states like North Korea still continue to participate in the Olympic Games, showing how the Olympic Games functions on this principle of participation. Countries already inherently want to win the Olympic Games, but they channel resources where they feel they have the best opportunity to win. Therefore, if they truly feel that women are their best hope at winning, these resources will naturally go to women without there being any need for any kind of imposition. But rather, imposing this kind of mindset only retards progression. As a first speaker today, I'll be telling you about retarding equality and protecting sovereignty. And my second speaker will tell you about fighting for the spirit of Olympics and harming international relations. On to my first point, substantive on retarding equality. The thesis of my argument is this: barring nations from participating in the Olympic Games breeds resentment and retards equality. When nations have this arbitrary criteria, I'll take it in a moment, sir, that gives them even more reason to resent the women within their country, what happens is that they're intolerant and angered. Yes, sir.
What does your side do about the systematic oppression of women on an international scale?
Sir, we don't think on our side we have to provide you an alternative because it's an evaluative debate. But on that level, we think on our side we promote a kind of ground-up change where mindsets are changed within society, where we don't have this kind of false imposition from a top-down approach, which does nothing but breed resentment and hatred towards these Western imperialist kind of imposition. Moving back to my case. They perceive this barring as an imposition which forces them to divert their resources away from their most important players, diverting them to women, and this creates a kind of resentment towards women. This therefore now retards any equality and opportunities for women because nations now recognize that their sovereignty is being stripped away from them. And this generates a kind of adverse mindset and anger towards women that causes them to either clamp down on women even more within society, or they adopt a tokenistic approach. They send one female player out, which doesn't do anything to promote equality. I'm going to give you an example of how condemnation on Saudi Arabia from the UN Women's Rights Committee caused even stronger government crackdown on feminist groups when they were sent to detention camps for causing societal divisiveness. This shows how punishing countries is never the approach to take because it angers them, creates resentment, and doesn't promote ground-up change. On my second point of substantive, on protecting sovereignty, the thesis of my argument is this: barring nations from the Olympics for their own policies infringes upon their sovereignty. Why is sovereignty so important? Because we recognize that governments have the ability to make decisions that they feel are in the best interest of their country. This is especially so in competitive events such as the Olympic Games, where it is important that countries need to have the ability to select people who best represent their country, who are best able to give them the best chance of winning. Sovereignty is already enshrined in UN Chapter 1, Article 2. Therefore, we see this is respected by the international community, and therefore, the international community has no place to impose any values on these sovereign states and force them to alter their own domestic policies when it has no third-party harm. For example, LGBT rights are recognized as the UNHRC as important, but yet they aren't imposed on any country. This goes to show how even in the event of important rights, the international community doesn't impose its own values by directly punishing these countries for their domestic policies, because the international community recognizes the importance of letting countries make their own domestic policies, adopting their own approach, and promoting ground-up change. Because our side truly stood for equality, our side didn't have some half-baked approach towards equality. I'm so proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes. Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 2 seconds.
I thank the first opposition speaker for a speech. And now, to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Ryan Sen.
With great power comes great responsibility. Because of the clout that the Olympic Games has, we think that it's the best mechanism to change the ideals of society. Two main points of contention for the House today. Firstly, which side better helps women? And secondly, which side better fulfills the ideals of the Olympic Games? They tried to tell us in their first speaker that nations with resources will naturally send women. But then they tried to tell us that some nations have a deep-rooted mindset. So we don't know which nations exist on their side, whether these nations will naturally send women or whether they don't. But even then, moving away from this contradiction that they made, the first point of contention, which side better helps women? The main fundamental argument was that we create resentment in the home countries. We argued to you that this would happen on two main counts. One, the Olympic Games barring nations from entering the Olympic Games merely creates discourse in the public, ultimately leading to organic change in legislation. My first speaker already brought 3 examples in India. I'm going to forward this argument by bringing to you examples in China, whereby China in the 80s started sending athletes to participate in the Olympic Games because they wanted to win medals, but ultimately the end result of it was increased legislation to protect the rights of the Chinese females. And we argue that the Olympic Games has done organic harm to these people. But secondly, we argue that there is no resentment on our side. Why? Because we think that the mindsets gradually are already moving away from conservatism, and we think that Olympic Games serves as an impetus to move them towards creating truly organic change in terms of legislation. And we think that this is good for females in general. Therefore, we bring down the entire argument that they will be creating resentment. But next, they came up to us with the idea in the first speaker that there is a deep-rooted mindset in society. This is hinged on the entire premise that society still remains as it was in the 1980s. Although we agree that the situation is not as ideal as we want it to be, we think the Olympic Games is a mechanism through which the ideals can be reached. But then they tried to force to us that these countries have some form of deep-rooted mindset. But I argue that many nations already, after seeing the international arena, are already moving away from conservatism. We bring forth to you ideas in Saudi Arabia, whereby women are not allowed to drive because of the fact that the Saudi government has decided to change its stance on the conservatism upon women. And we think that the international pressure that has been enacted upon Saudi Arabia has allowed it to change. And we think that Olympic Games is a mechanism through which international pressure can be exerted. But next, they try to argue to us that we shouldn't divert resources away from males to females. We think that no, our side has already clarified this in our first speaker, whereby we told to you that our side supports the fact that when women are able to participate and meet the Olympic prerequisite for participating in their sport, they should be allowed to do so, and their country should send them to it. This doesn't mean that it will cut down on funding on males. We think that in any cases, the IOC generally already provides funding, and the UN can do so to nations who are suffering from financial crisis, whereby they are able to send the athletes. We don't think that any athlete should be denied the chance because of the fact that she is a female. But even then, moving on to the second point of contention, which side better fulfills the ideals of the Olympic Games. They try to point to us a possible contradiction on our side. While we say that we want equality because we want all people to participate, and yet we bar some nations to do so. But I think the first and most important situation that must be resolved is the fact that these women's rights are systematically removed from these nations, and we argue that the most important criteria on our side is to help these women. And we think that if our side is able to prove to you they're better able to help women, then we necessarily take this debate. But even then, we think that the rights of women supersede the rights of these nations to participate in the Olympic Games. Why is this so? Because we've already brought you the contextualization of what happens in these countries in my first speaker, and the situation is as nice as they portray it to be. They already told us that there are deep-rooted mindsets, which is why we create a rape culture and the discrimination against women. Forcibly, for example, in the Afghan Taliban, preventing them from even going to school. We tell you that these are the instances that happen in these nations, and these are the situations that must be resolved immediately. But in the second substantive, they tried to tell us the idea of sovereignty. They told us that countries are now forced and have some form of imposition upon them. We argue that on two counts, this isn't true. By one, this is an external force. This doesn't impose or try to make them a puppet state whereby they control the government. We merely say that this is an international pressure exerted upon them, which we think is effective. But secondly, on any count, we think that the notion of sovereignty on their side is to protect and provide equal rights to all citizens. And we argue that our side is best able to achieve sovereignty when we allow women the right to vote and the basic rights that they deserve. And therefore, on proposition, we take this point. But next, they try to argue to us that we isolate nations. We think this is exactly what they need. They need the impetus for change, and our side is able to provide it to them. When we isolate them from the international community and show them the consequences when they don't respect the right of females. And here's where I transition to my two substantives for the House today. Firstly, on the idea of meritocracy of athletes, and secondly, on the increased credibility of the Olympic Games. The thesis of my first argument on the meritocracy of athletes. The thesis of this argument is that women who are capable of participating in these sports but systematically disallowed to, we think that this should be changed. Meritocracy is an important principle in sport, which is the reason why many international teams have pre-qualification, prerequisites. Hold on a moment, madam, to ensure that these athletes are deserving of participating in the international meets. Yes, madam.
Your side results in tokenistic measures because in order to meet your minimum requirement, they're just going to send one unprepared individual.
No, madam. We argue to you that when these females meet the Olympic criteria to do so, they'll already be required to send them in their countries. This is why it's already happening in many instances, whereby people have already qualifying times they need to meet, for example, in swimming or running, to ensure that they are able to take part in the Olympic Games. And if we think that women are able to meet this criteria, then they should be sent by their country. Moving back to my arguments. The next argument is that meritocracy allows competitors and rivals to treat each other as equal under the eyes of sports. And one triumphs because he has an edge over another physically. In these more conservative societies that side opposition is trying to talk about in the deep-rooted mindsets, women who are able to meet the necessary qualifications are disallowed in competing. We argue that when countries have the means and resources to send these females but don't, this actively impinges upon their right to participate, and this is unfair both to sporting principles and to the athletes. We think that meritocratic ideals must be upheld in sports to ensure consistency in sports. And this is why I transition to my second argument on the increased credibility of the Olympic Games. The thesis of this argument is that the Olympic Games must uphold its own fundamental core values in order to increase its credibility as the world's biggest international sporting meet. The premise of this argument is that the Olympic Games is the most widely watched international sports meet in the history of humanity. No, like you, madam. Much is at stake, and many eyes are watching the every move of the IOC. The IOC has historically fought for the equality and chance of all individuals to participate as equals and not be systematically oppressed by their own countries. We bring forth to you the idea of expanding the Olympic Games, the inclusion of the Winter Games in 1948 and the Paralympic Games in 1960. This shows the efforts of the IOC already to expand its Olympic Games in order to accommodate more people to show their sporting talents. They already are strong advocates for equality and in need and in the beliefs of these sporting needs. Even in the creed, as my first speaker has already pointed out, it already includes the idea that these people should have the right to be included in the Olympic Games. This is a very important principle on which the Olympic Games was founded out, because we think that people shouldn't be denied the chance because of their own government and not because of their own ability. But we argue that the IOC has already been hampered recently by many doping controversies, and we think that there is a need for it to regain its credibility. Why do we think that portrayal of women's rights in a better light is important for it? Because we tell you that this is already a notion adopted by many international countries around the world. And we think it is good if the IOC makes a distinct stance. And we say that it is important for it to make a distinct stance because then it shows that it truly supports the ideologies they originally stood for. And we think that it's important for the IOC to gain its credibility because there is much at stake at the International Olympic Games. On our side, we want women to be able to hold their heads high and sing their national anthem at the prize giving ceremony and be able to say the motto of the Olympic Games, Citius, Altius, Fortius.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 5 seconds.
I thank the second proposition speaker for his speech. And now, to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Aloysius Chan.
I quote Proposition's second speaker in stating, already strong channels for equality. If that was the case, why was a ban for a nation from the Olympic Games even necessary in the first place? The underlying flaw in Proposition's case is that they exploited the Olympic Games as a vehicle to drive their agenda into the minds of nations without regard for whether they would actually receive it. Despite the apolitical nature of sport, despite the inbuilt existence of other channels for doing so as they conceded, and despite giving us a very tenuous link on how they assumed that a ban would necessarily lead to immediate change in the situation of women's rights in a country, despite the entrenched mentalities that both sides agreed upon, despite the fervor of resentment that my first speaker forwarded in her arguments. Why was a ban the best and the only way to achieve this? No definitive answer on their side. Their side was muddled in contradiction. They told us within their first speaker that the problem of women's rights is dire. Yet their second speaker gave us an example of how the situation of women in states such as Saudi Arabia was steadily improving.
Sir.
Going by that logic, no thank you sir, the organic change that they so desperately wanted was already taking place in the absence of a ban for the Olympic Games. Progression happened, whether or not their policy came true or not.
Sir.
No thank you sir. And from that stance came two main points of contention. Firstly, on political voice in the Olympics, and secondly, on change in the home nations. On to the first point of contention, on political voice in the Olympic Games. Proposition asserted that the International Olympic Committee was necessarily the best agent to promote this change through the mechanism of a ban. As my first speaker has already told you, a ban from a sport which has such a key unifying factor as they forwarded in their own substantive, could never achieve this. The International Olympic Committee is an apolitical organization which isn't supposed to forward a specific stance of its own. Where the Olympics has been used as a platform for spreading ideology, it has been on the volition of individual nations and never on the organizing body. A ban on the Olympics was at its root a flawed course of action, and I will be furthering this idea in my own first substantive on how the spirit of the Olympics is completely sullied by the imposition of an agenda. And here's where their second speaker's substantive on the credibility of the Olympics came in. On the first level, this is not true, because credibility is even reduced where the IOC takes up an official agenda. For example, using their own example of the Black Power salute at the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games, it was this very salute that drew fierce condemnation of the International Olympic Committee for allowing it to occur on the podium ceremony. Yes, sir.
If the Black Power salute allow for the furthering of the civil rights movement, then don't you think this is a good thing for nations for participating?
Sir, we have already mentioned how there are other channels for athletes to express their opinions on the advancement of civil rights. The Olympics is and should never be the platform for doing this where it's officially sanctioned by the IOC. It can be down to the athletes, but never through an official ban, which is the heart of this motion. Therefore, your point falls. On to the second point of contention then, on fostering change in these nations for the promotion of women's rights. Proposition wanted to talk about how negative reinforcement led to change, even as my first speaker already clearly set out how barring nations from the Olympics robbed them of the benefits of sport, fostered resentment, and therefore stymied the advancement of women's rights. Opposition prefers a ground-up approach, where change comes from the volition of the population and not by forced imposition by a direct authority that was never in a position to do that in the first place. Their second speaker told us that the imposition of a ban would give rise to organic change, even though their own first speaker gave us the characteristic of deeply rooted discriminatory mindsets, and I quote, rape culture. We agree, and their side makes it even worse by imposing an arbitrary form of international pressure that strips nations of the benefits of sport. We are going to use their own substantive of the unifying factor of sport against them, because banning nations from the Olympics also bans this unifying factor that they wanted to talk about and only worsens the conditions in the home countries. In the end, proposition never promoted women's rights. And here's where their substantive of meritocracy came in, which was a largely peripheral issue and never definitively linked to how a ban would necessarily give rise to this. Indeed, it is worse on their side, where the mechanisms to achieve meritocracy among athletes was completely lost for both men and for women, where nations were no longer allowed to take part in the Olympics, and meritocratic selection processes didn't take place. I'm now transitioning to my own constructive arguments. Firstly, on the spirit of the Olympics. And here's where we clash directly with Proposition's vision of what the Olympics should be. The thesis of this argument is that the Olympics is and should be a platform for the showcase of sport, divorced from any socio-political agenda, and therefore cannot be an official mechanism to censure nations. Since its inception in 1896, the Olympics has always stood as a bastion for pure sportsmanship, where nations, regardless of political ideology or contention, are able to face each other fairly on the field of sport. This is a defining characteristic of the Olympics, where the participation of all nations is fostered, 206 as at London 2012. The mechanism by which all nations are drawn to participate is therefore divorcing Olympic sport from any specific political agenda. And where any agenda was imposed in the past, it was never by the IOC, which would be the agent imposing a ban on any state in the first place. For example, even at the height of its racist apartheid policy, limiting the opportunities of the Afrikaans in response to the white Afrikaners, South Africa was at no point officially barred from the Olympic Games. Indeed, their non-participation was down to their own volition. Likewise, despite bitter differences in political ideology, the IOC has never enforced a ban of North Korea from the Olympics, enabling them to fulfill the Olympic criteria and vision of participation of all states. Therefore, the spirit of the Olympics, that sport cannot be contaminated by any agenda so as to allow all nations the chance to participate, cannot be violated by a ban on the side of proposition, on the mere premise of athlete choice. The fundamental ethics of the Olympic Games cannot be compromised by a ban. This brings me to my second argument on international relations. The thesis of this being that barring a state from the Olympics on the premise of athlete choice only results in further separation of the nation from the global community, fostering conflict and hindering change. Where the Olympics is a framework for nations to come together, the barring of an entire nation from the event only forces it to retreat from the world stage. No thank you. These states hence resent the International Olympic Committee and other nations for their exclusion, which robs them of sporting opportunities and tarnishes their international image. Where their censure is officially sanctioned and their participation, regardless of national choice, is prevented, the inevitable result is the distancing of the country to become a pariah state. Therefore, instead of advancing the interests of women, barring states only causes them to be even more insular, ignoring the calls of the international community, leading to further enmity against states pushing them and hampering progress towards women's rights. Here's where we draw a parallel to how English football clubs were temporarily excluded from European competition in 1996 by UEFA following reports of hooliganism and rioting amongst fans. However, the distancing of these football clubs did nothing but build hostility against the European mainland and never resolved the hooliganism issue, which persists unabated to this day. Likewise, barring states from the Olympics having the potential to fire up international tension cannot be the means to enact change and has not been the means to enact change. Thus, we truly believe in the prospect that the Olympics is a platform, apolitical, where all nations can stand together.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 2 seconds.
I thank the second opposition speaker for his speech. And now, to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Joel Gee.
I'm first going to talk about how it is indeed justified for the Olympic Committee to ban countries from taking part in the Olympics if they refuse to let their women athletes take part. And secondly, I'll be talking to you about how it is our side that improves women's rights. First, on how it's justified to do so. Opposition brought to us in the second substantive and their first speaker the concept of sovereignty. They told us that we were imposing on the domestic affairs. We would like to point out that this entire substantive was dropped entirely in the second speaker. In essence, they concede their first principle point already because they refused to deal with it. What did my second speaker tell you about how this is illegitimate? First of all, we told you that we weren't actually imposing on sovereignty because international pressure doesn't actually equate to meddling and controlling government like a puppet state, which is what the high premise of sovereignty means. Therefore, we already told you and we already took down this point. But we went one step further and told you that even if we are imposing on sovereignty, so be it. We are fine with it. Because sovereignty and the nation's sovereignty is based upon the premise that it can protect its people and there is a legitimate government. When a government can't even protect 50% of its populace, that it shouldn't be a government, sovereignty cannot be upheld. They completely dropped this point. We take it that they concede already. Let's talk about what we actually told you about. We told you about how the purpose of the Olympic Games was to ensure inclusiveness. Because as we quote the Olympic Creed, the most important thing in the Olympic Games is not to win, but to take part. They told us that no, we are not equal when we bar countries from taking part. We have two responses to this. The first of all is that the core issue about this is whether inclusiveness in this sense refers to countries or refers to athletes. Clearly we argue that it refers to athletes in the sense. Why? Because it's about athletes taking part and be able to have discourse about the issue. That's the most important thing in the Olympic Games. When women aren't even allowed to go there and take part in the sport, then there isn't much of an inclusiveness. But secondly, we argue that it is precisely because of this barring they will often cause these countries to give in and allow women to take part. Anyway, as an example, we bring to you how international pressure from the United States and Europe has caused, for instance, Saudi Arabia to lift its ban on women driving. We're not saying that the situation is good, and let's be very clear about it. There's a lot more to be done. No, hold on a moment, ma'am. But we're just saying that international pressure can and will continue to work under our side of the house where we bar such countries from taking part in the Olympic Games and send them a strong message. Yes?
When a country sends the unprepared women out to compete, she fails on national television. Tell us how you ever help them change mindsets.
Well, the fact is, first of all, at least that woman gets on national television in the very first place. The sheer fact that people see that a government is willing to send women to the international stage is already message enough that the government stands behind this woman and pushes this forward, this fight for women's rights. I'll be further elaborating on this in my second part of contention. But what did it next tell us? So therefore, to conclude our point earlier, effectively on our side of the house, we allow the inclusion of both women athletes as well as countries, because countries often give in to such international pressure. But they told us in the third substantive in the second speaker that the Olympics was inherently meant to be an apolitical organization. To which we say, no, this simply isn't true. It isn't about politics anymore, ladies and gentlemen, when the issue is about fundamental human rights. They told us about how they refused to bar South Africa even during the apartheid regime. And we argue that they should have. They should have done so because apartheid was a pretty bad thing. And the message that the IOC sends is important and is vital to prevent this. So even if they argue that historically it hasn't been an apolitical organization, we say no, it should be an apolitical organization. Rather, it shouldn't be. And therefore, they should take a stance on such issues. Finally, we brought to you in our third substantive, no thank you, about meritocracy, to which they really didn't have any response to this point whatsoever, so we take it that their side falls. What does this mean? It means that another tenet of the Olympic Games, one of meritocracy, where people are judged on a fair basis, is not upheld on their side of the house, because women are not even allowed to take part in the very first place. They have to do with this in the third substantive. Therefore, I've shown you on 2 counts that it is justified, our course of action rather, is justified. First of all, it doesn't fulfill the principle of inclusiveness of the Olympic Games. Second of all, it does not fulfill meritocracy. Second point of attention about women's rights. Opposition told us in the first substantive that this policy will cause, hold on a moment ma'am, will cause the country to see women as the cause of their ban and thus regress women's rights. But before I move on, yes.
Your side discredits the Olympic Games by turning it into a tool for Western democracies to impose their own ideals and forward their messages.
No, guys, it's not about Western democracies. It is not about Western democracies. It's about women being able to access fundamental rights and preventing things like rape culture from happening. This is not Western democracy. This is rights of women. There's a distinction between the two, and we are perfectly proud to say that if it is Western democracy, then we are fine with standing for it. But what did they tell us instead? All the alternatives that they brought to us were this: organic change. Organic change. Even though they conceded that there was an entrenched mentality in the state. And we argue that this organic change isn't going to happen on their side of the house. Because, as both sides agrees, it's an entrenched mentality that is deeply rooted within society and cannot be changed. But what does our side do? Our side allows these countries to kickstart discourse on this, as my second speaker brought to you. Because at least then it allows for something to happen. And as they told us, this already is already happening. When they told us that the situation is improving, it is because of international pressure that the situation is improving. So yes, it is precisely because of international pressure that has kick-started the discourse and allowed governments to take the step forward to improve women's rights. Therefore, we argue that it's on our side of the house that we empower women. In our second substantive, how we do so. But even if we accept that at the end of the day, maybe for a temporary period of time, our side maybe does regress women's rights. Because people might hate these women and see them as the cause of the country being barred. But we argue that in the long term, our side is the side that best empowers women. Why? In the short term, while these women may be seen as being the cause of such barrings, in the long term, at least this will provoke discourse, and this will ensure that a fundamental mindset shift can occur within this country, because our side is the side that allows for the kick-starting of such reactions. We bring you the example of the Black Power salute. Yes, as both sides admit, it was a very controversial issue at that time. It was during the civil rights era where black men were getting lynched. But the fact of the matter is, it was one of the things that kick-started the civil rights movement and allowed for greater discourse and greater presence of blacks on the international scale. So even if our side regresses it for a short time, in a short while, on the long term, we allow for full acceptance of women, no thank you, within the country. In the long term, our side best benefits women. Finally, they brought to us 2 more ideas. First, in their fourth substantive about how this will actually exclude such places and turn them into pariah states. That is simply not true. Why? Because we are only doing this on the Olympic front, and thus there are already other measures to engage them as well. But furthermore, we argue that even if this turns them into a pariah state, that's a good thing. Why? Because eventually these nations know that they cannot forever remain as pariah states, and they have to engage with big superpowers like the West. Therefore, this means that even if they turn to pariah states for the short term, eventually they have to engage with these ideas and turn around their ideas of what women's rights should be like, and thus better women's rights in the future. Finally, brought to us now first substantive about how this will only serve as a tokenistic measure. I already answered that this is better on our side, because at least it shows that the government is behind this movement by sending that one woman to the international stage and that one woman out there to represent the country. What I will therefore show you today, 2 things. First of all, it is indeed justified on our side of the house to carry out this course of action. Second of all, it is on our side of the house that we best understand and protect women's rights. And it is for all these reasons that Proposition is proud to let women stand up on the world stage and say, Sitius, Altius, Fortius.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 2 seconds.
the third proposition speaker for his speech. And now, to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Annette Yeo.
Be able to stand up on an Olympic stage and say citrus, I don't know what they were saying. But more than that, women within these countries like Saudi Arabia will never be able to stand up there either because of the kind of resentment that comes about in Proposition's case. Because opposition agrees that women's rights must be respected, but we detest their mechanism of sports as well as their assumption that it must be done now, at a time where society isn't ready, at a time where society already has this sort of rape culture that they considered within their first speaker. But more than that, Proposition also tried to have their cake and eat it too, where within their first speaker, they told us that this rape culture exists. But when we pushed them, they considered within their second speaker that there's already a liberalization within these countries themselves. Therefore, going by that logic, their policy and their belief isn't even needed in the first place at all. So we're going to assume that it's just about rape culture and that's the fundamental problem which they wanted to solve at the end of the day. So let's deal with this debate in two main points of contention. Firstly, on what's best for women, and secondly, on what's best for sports. So now let's move on to the first point of substantive, where they tried to bring us under their second substantive on how we further women's rights. On the first layer of analysis, when you listen to their characterization, where I quote, the situation is already bad. Yes, precisely that's why the situation is already bad, which is why you cannot use an external means of approaching the issue, using the characterization, because it just simply means that there is more resentment. But on the second layer of analysis, my second speaker already told you why it just results in simply more tokenistic measures. But on the third layer of analysis, they just tried to tell us that being on TV is enough, and that is what we want at the end of the day. But it's simply not true, because you make the situation worse. Because when you send these unprepared women out there, even if they were on television and they fail to win any medals, it simply means that you give anti-women campaigns even more rhetoric to say that these women are weak, that we shouldn't have this policy in the first place. It means that your feminist campaigns, your anti-women campaigns just recede and the other simply gets stronger. So that is why Proposition being on TV isn't enough, but we have to ensure a society and a culture where the women are ready and the women are able to take the stage for themselves and not because of some kind of quota imposed. And that is why their side is going to be fundamentally worse. But more than that, they also consider within their third speaker that women's rights are going to be retarded in the short term, and their only check against that was discourse. But when you listen to their kinds of characterization of rape culture, what kind of discourse are you going to be getting within society itself? It's going to be discourse which is dominated by the males. It's going to be discourse which says that women failed to win anything in the Olympics. They shouldn't be here, and that is why the sort of discourse which was their only check and balance within their third speaker simply failed. So that is why Proposition resulted in an even worse situation for women at the end of the day. So that is why we win the point on women's rights. So now let's move on to the second idea, which was their third substantive on sending an international image. But on the first layer of analysis, my first speaker already told you why precisely because it's the Olympics, you cannot promote an international image of intolerance and imposition. But even if we take their argument that sports was a rallying point for all individuals, let's examine why sports is actually a rallying point. Because individuals love sports at its core. It's all about the soccer clubs, it's all about who wins and who loses. It's never about the inequalities and the women's rights, which is why states like North Korea can still take part, because even if they're fundamental human rights abusers, individuals still come together because they can recognize and appreciate the sports that these individuals come together with. So therefore, even if sports was a rallying point, it wasn't because of human rights that they rallied together. It was because of your soccer. It was because of sports like basketball, and that is why it's never even better on Proposition at the end of the day. So now let's move on. But before, yes.
When you have such forms of socially entrenched behavior, how does your side have any form of organic change?
So our side first and foremost, my first speaker already told you why we don't need to prove an alternative. But even if your side is even worse, because of the sort of anti-feminist and anti-women rhetoric that your side results in. So therefore, like your own example of Saudi Arabia, we can leave it to status quo where there are already very huge markers and improvements to show that the situation is indeed improving. So now let's move on to the next idea of sovereignty, which was our second substantive. And the only response we heard is an external force. We're not forcing you to do anything, it's simply international pressure. But going by that logic, then the entire case becomes futile, and because even if with this international pressure, but it never results in any concrete change, then proposition just undercut their own policy because they conceded that their policy results in nothing. They conceded that their policy results in no tangible changes within society. But more than that, within their third speaker, he tried to save it and say that, oh, because these people failed to protect them and therefore sovereignty should be abolished as a whole. But when you listen to that kind of logic, it's precisely that kind of logic that has resulted in things like military invasions. It's precisely because of that logic that has resulted in economic sanctions, using the legitimacy that these individuals have failed to provide for fundamental human rights like going to the Olympics. But more than that, already a sort of Western construct in and of itself. So therefore, on that point, they also concede that sovereignty isn't actually, and that sovereignty has to be upheld, which is why we don't immediately resort to things like military invasions at the end of the day. No, thank you, sir. So having dealt with the first large point of contention, let's move on to the second large point of contention on what's best for sports. Under this was their first substantive on the principles of equality. Here they tried to tell us that, oh, we need that the Olympics is all about being equal within society. On the first layer of analysis, my first speaker already told you why it isn't, because this sort of inequality simply results in an imposition on countries that don't follow the certain standard human rights. But even if, let's give you additional reasons for why their side is even worse and even violates the fundamental principles of equality, because it simply becomes reverse discrimination. Because when it's down to the last spot between a male and a female, even though the male is more capable than the particular female, the spot will go to the less capable female, even because they need to meet a particular quota to have one particular woman within the sports contingent at the end of the day. So it also harms the principles of equality because of the quota that proposition is implementing on their side. So therefore their side is even worse. But on the second layer of it, but on the second big idea, which was my second speaker's first substantive, they just told us that these aren't Western imperialists, these are fundamental human rights. But it's precisely that kind of rhetoric that fuels a sort of extremism within these sort of countries itself. It is precisely that sort of rhetoric that says that not going to the Olympics is a fundamental violation of human rights. It's that sort of rhetoric that fuels extremism in and of itself. But on the second idea, on the idea of meritocracy, on the first layer of analysis, they assumed that it was because these women weren't capable, which is why they weren't going there. But on the second layer of analysis, my second speaker already told you why meritocracy is clamped down for everyone, because now the entire contingent cannot go for the Olympics as a whole. But even if at the end of the day we always need to weigh it up, because we always need to weigh out what's best for the woman versus versus upholding some falutin idea of meritocracy. Because what happens is that you simply result in this woman being targeted even more. So therefore, on an even if layer, we always have to strive for the welfare of the women at the end of the day. But on the second idea of the credibility of the Olympics, they simply just told us, we already told you why it reduces it when it becomes politicized and fuels Western extremism. So therefore, because we truly do what's best for women as well as for the countries as a whole, I am proud to stand on the side that does what's best for women.
Just vote for 8 minutes and 18 seconds.
I thank the third opposition speaker for her speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, please welcome Aloysius.
The International Olympic Committee as an agent to impose a forcible agenda on nations and an affront to sovereignty, and therefore barring everyone from that nation from participating in the Olympic Games, versus the change free of imposition from the ground up with access to sport for that nation. Two disparate frameworks in today's debate that crystallized around two key areas of clash. Firstly, on what was best for women's rights, and secondly, on what was best for the Olympic Games. On both counts, the side that did the best was opposition. On to the first area of clash on what was best for women's rights. Proposition attempted to argue that their stance would lead to increased activism for women's rights. Never mind that it only built resentment against women in the first place. How women prevented the country, or at least were perceived to prevent the country from going into the Olympic Games and triumphing on the international stage. How this would in the end force countries to turn against their own women and up the level of discrimination that these females in their society ultimately faced. Proposition told us that a message would be sent by the international community when we already told you that their deliberate exclusion from an international forum resulted in even worse harms, making them far more insular, allowing them to turn a blind eye, to shut their ears from the rallying cries of the international community to give their women more rights. How it only built anger towards the international community and thus did nothing to promote change. Instead, what happened under Proposition? Resentment. How all the benefits of sport that they characterized in their substantive were ultimately lost by barring the nation outright from the Olympic Games. And as a result of this, how backlash against women increased exponentially. How, like in Saudi Arabia, they were barred from driving. How UN condemnation of Saudi Arabia, a similar mechanism that Proposition advocated for, only resulted in further crackdowns on their rights. Here's where opposition's own substantives came in, on reducing equality in the home nation through the mechanism of such backlash, and how change could never be imposed, forced down the throat of a nation which already had entrenched mindsets, but rather had to take root from the ground up. And that could never be achieved if the International Olympic Committee took such punitive action. On to the second main area of clash, on what was best for the Olympic Games. Here, Proposition came up and said that the Olympics were always intended to forward an agenda. Yes, but we have consistently told you that was only by individual athletes, never within the official ambits of the International Olympic Committee, never within the official ambits of a ban on any single nation, because the IOC was always an apolitical organization that provided a framework for all nations to participate, and they didn't want to deter any of the 206 that were at stake. That's why North Korea went to London. That's why South Korea was able, South Africa was able to participate in all the Olympic Games, but declined the chance when the chance was open to them, despite the apartheid regime in place. They gave us a substantive on sovereignty, on meritocracy, which I already rebutted in my own speech. How meritocracy was already outright compromised when you barred the nation outright and limited opportunities based on meritocracy, not only for women, but also for men. How nobody could benefit from meritocracy as a consequence of their ban. They tried to build on the credibility of the Olympic Games, even when their own example of the 1968 Black Power salute tarnished the reputation of the Olympic Games. How they were never supposed to be a platform for airing these sort of views, and how they, in the end, did what was worse for the credibility of the Olympics. In our own substantives, we upheld the credibility and the sanctity of sport, how it was supposed to be apolitical by nature and could never unfairly discriminate one country based on this flimsy premise. And in the end, Proposition reduced the Olympic Games to nothing more than a mechanism to forward one-sided Western ideals, as their speaker conceded in forcing countries to, quote, turn to the West. Proposition wanted to win at shooting, but shot themselves in the foot. And standing on the podium, proudly on the side of opposition, was a woman.
Thank you, Aloysius. And now to continue the case and to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, please welcome Brian Sam.
When Mary Kom of India stepped into the boxing ring, that wasn't the only fight she faced. Mary Kom had to fight for the equality of genders in the country. We are proud that this happens on Proposition. These athletes have a dream that they want to fulfill, and they should get the chance to realize it if they are capable. And on our side, we want women who are able to compete in the Olympic Games will do so, and we don't want governments to systematically oppress the women and prevent them from participating in the Olympic Games, even if they can. It is regrettable that opposition tried to trivialize the issue with just rape culture. We think it is more than that. It is about the fact that these women do not have the chance to vote, do not have the chance to go to school, and these are basic rights that each individual should have. It is truly regrettable that while opposition talked about nations, they ignored the people that were the most affected, the women. But we on this side, even though RI may be an all-boys team, we stood for the equality of gender. They tried to assert that their side protects people better. But what exactly did they tell us was their mechanism? First, the idea of organic change. They never told us what exactly is the impetus to allow it to happen. They just tried to forward down their 4 speakers. We already proved to you that there won't be organic change if there isn't pressure. But secondly, they told us in their 3rd speaker that we should just allow them to wait and see what happens after that. But we think that when these women are getting raped, they can't go to school, they can't vote. We think that something must be done now. We don't think that inaction of opposition will solve the problem. So what was the model that proposition forwarded? We brought you 2 lines of ideas. One, the idea of international pressure by the IOC and other international organizations. And secondly, the message that this sends to these countries. And this can work to create a more inclusive society for females in the countries that are currently oppressing them. Why? Because one, this creates public discourse when we see that these countries are barred from entering the Olympic Games as a result of the actions. But secondly, we can see more liberalization on our side, because when these nations want to participate in the Olympic Games, they must send females that are capable of possibly winning medals. The only rebuttal to this through all the speakers was the fact that our side would increase resentment. Really, when Saudi Arabia allowed women to drive, it was from pressure from international organizations. They didn't regress upon the fact that their women needed more rights in their country. When Afghanistan refused to send women to box in the Olympics, even though they were capable of doing so, we tell you that international pressure will work because it has already done so through many examples that you brought up. We want a day when countries know that their duty is to protect all citizens, not just the chauvinistic idea of protecting males. I'm proud to say that on proposition, we better help women even though we may be an all-boys team. But moving on to the next issue, on what exactly are the principles of the Olympic Games. We told you in our first speaker that when the Olympics was formed, it was not just for sports, but also for the humanistic ideals for all living people in the world. When opposition talked about sovereignty, which they unfortunately dropped after their first speaker, they never told us, we told you already 2 things. One, that these countries don't even deserve this sovereignty, especially if they can't protect the rights of these women. But secondly, we are able to take action if we truly prove that we can help these women in these countries. Then as I tried to recede in a 3rd speaker to how our side just sends women for show, a token. But we told you that no, this is not true. Already a clarification was made in our first proposition speaker that countries are only allowed to send females that meet the qualifying requirements of the Olympic Games. This was something made very clear from the start, and we don't see any reason why they should have brought it up. They told us about examples where North Korea can go to London, South Africa can participate in the Olympic Games, but we think that they should have changed their model about how they treat women before they should have done so. And ultimately on our side, I'm proud to say that we established that we hope for a day whereby women can stand in front of 1,000 cameras and say, Citius, Altius, Fortius.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the debate. Please wait in the room while the adjudicators go out to deliberate on the verdict.
So I wanted to get an answer to how you construct and perceive the world and which one was more consistent in doing so. Secondly, on sovereignty, this other question that occurred to us. Is this policy going to be seen as an imposition, or is it just harmless international pressure? Can there ever be harmless international pressure? What is then the root of sovereignty? Is it people, or are there states that care and function? Is sovereignty slightly different when pitched at the level of the individual versus the level of the state? And regardless of what the answer is, how does the concept of sovereignty interplay with the actor carrying out the policy in this particular place? So we wanted to look for a more consistent understanding of where sovereignty applied in this particular context. Third, the spirit of the Olympics. Both sides had their own idea of what the spirit of the Olympics were, and they were well elaborated on both ends. The question then for the judges are, moving beyond a priori assumptions that these ideals are good things in and of themselves, which side better showed why the axiom mattered relative to the other axiom on the other side, and why in this particular context of women's rights, which axiom, assuming they're all important in some form or the other, should take precedence, and which I answered the question. And fourthly, women. Do women need much help in the first place? That goes back to the framework. Is appearing on television good enough to change the way women are perceived? Or must you also do well? And is that even necessary? And both sides could have done a lot more analysis on to whom are you trying to appeal? To whom are these women appearing on TV to? And how are those mindsets changing? And furthermore, exactly what are the logical links between this policy of a ban leading to legislative or sustained change, or leading to backlash, which is noticeably worse than the status quo and therefore should be considered a significant detriment. So these are broadly large areas in which the judges considered, and in the end we came down to a few things that helped us break the tie to decide in favor of one team. One team was more consistent in the way they understood and framed the world. One team was slightly better at understanding the cause and effect link between the ban and their chosen outcome. One team was slightly better at the way they better understood and used evidence and responded to evidence in the real world, basically examples and how you use them properly. And ultimately, one team also understood the role of the IOC better, given the kind of quickly context it operates in. And so that's on those 4 reasons we gave the win to Anglo-Chinese Junior College.